Hi, everybody. Tonight we begin a journey back in time, back to the soft rustle of skirts on polished wooden floors, to the sound of bells chiming in narrow corridors, to the low murmur of voices below stairs. Our story unfolds in the early 1900s in the quiet hum of an Edwardian household. This was a world of order, of routine, of unseen hands that worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance above. But what was it really like to be one of those hands? One of the servants? This story is not one of lords and ladies, not of grand balls or aristocratic intrigues. It is instead a tale woven from early mornings and aching feet, from whispered confidences in the scullery, from stolen moments of rest beneath the stairwell. It is the story of life below stairs, of duty, loyalty, quiet rebellion, and dreams held tightly within calloused hands. So lie back. Let the candlelight of another age flicker in your imagination. Breathe in the scent of coal smoke and polish. Listen as we begin part one of our tale. The morning bell rang. In the servants' quarters of Graymore House, a grand estate nestled in the verdant hills of Sussex, the air was still heavy with sleep when the first tremor of the bell cut through the dim corridor. A faint, tinny sound, but to the dozen servants who slept in those narrow rooms, it was the clarion call of duty. Annie Fletcher stirred first. She was the youngest maid, barely 16, fresh from a stone cottage at the edge of the village. Her cheeks were still round with youth, but her hands already bore the red cracks of lye soap and icy water. Annie slipped out of bed, her feet brushing the cold floor as she reached for her apron. Around her, the others began to stir too, the groan of iron bed frames, the shuffle of stiff linen. The house had not yet woken above. The family would still be in the cradle of dreams. But below stairs, the rhythm of the day had already begun. Annie's job was simple, in theory: light the fires. Every morning, she padded silently through the draughty halls before even the first hint of sunrise, her arms laden with coal, her fingers blackened with soot. Drawing room, library, bedrooms, each hearth needed to be cleaned and fed before its owner stirred. The work was cold, and it was lonely, but there was something curiously sacred about it too. The quiet hush of pre-dawn, the flicker of flames blooming in the darkness. In the scullery, Mrs. Potter was already bustling. She was the cook and the heartbeat of the servant world. Stern-eyed and broad-shouldered, Mrs. Potter ruled the kitchen with the precision of a general and the tenderness of a mother hen. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every weakness in the pantry walls. She could sense with uncanny accuracy when a roast needed turning, or when a kitchen maid was slacking. "Annie, don't dawdle," she barked gently as the girl passed with her coal scuttle. "And mind you, keep those ashes from trailing behind you again. I don't want the master stepping in soot before breakfast." Annie nodded, cheeks flushed, and hurried on. Upstairs, behind doors carved with rose motifs, the family still slept under eider-down quilts. They would not hear the clatter of pails or the hiss of kettle steam. Their mornings began only after the work had already been done. By 6, the day was in full swing below stairs. John Mallory, the footman, was polishing the brass fixtures in the main hallway, his sleeves rolled high, shoulders bent in concentration. John had once hoped to be a teacher, but work was scarce in those years, and service, especially in a great house, meant stability. He was handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a thoughtful gaze, but in the servant world, charm was currency only if spent wisely. He kept his ambitions quiet, folded away in his chest, like the pressed pages of poetry he sometimes wrote in the still of night. The butler, Mr. Redgrave, descended with measured footsteps, his every movement precise. He carried himself with a calm authority, a man who knew every wine in the cellar and every wrinkle in the linens. Redgrave had served at Graymore House for over 20 years. He was tall, thin, immaculately dressed. His voice was low and even, as though he spoke in velvet. Most of the younger staff were slightly afraid of him, but also, in their own way, in awe. "Mr. Mallory," he said quietly, inspecting the brass, "you missed a spot." John nodded without protest, reaching again for the cloth. There was no room for pride here. Precision was everything. Appearances mattered, even, perhaps especially, where no one looked. Breakfast preparations began at 7 sharp. The family's trays would be taken up by the parlor maid, Clara, who moved like clockwork. Clara had been in service for almost a decade. She could set a table with her eyes closed, knew the Earl's preferred egg softness to the second, and could anticipate Lady Marianne's moods based on the color of her morning robe. There was a kind of art to breakfast service. Toast must arrive warm but never soggy, tea strong but never bitter, the bacon arranged in a way that was aesthetically pleasing yet modest. Clara's hands moved with mechanical elegance, but inside her chest was a longing, barely acknowledged even to herself, for something more than eggs and china, than murmured thank yous and invisible glances. As the food rose on polished trays, the servants descended again into the shadows. Their breakfast came only after the family had finished theirs. It was eaten quickly, in a cramped dining room where the scent of polish mingled with the fading perfume of toast. There were no starched linens here, no fine china, just plain plates, thick cups, shared jam jars, and tired eyes. Conversations flickered between bites, idle gossip, a comment about the weather, a muttered joke about Lord Halcomb's obsession with punctuality. But there were rules here too. Never speak too loudly, never criticize the family within earshot of Mr. Redgrave, and never let your weariness show. And so the day continued, each hour mapped out with the careful order of an unwritten rule book. Rooms had to be aired, silver polished, letters delivered, linen ironed, boots shined. Nothing could be out of place. To be a servant in an Edwardian household was to exist as a ghost in plain sight, a presence always there, always necessary, yet never acknowledged beyond function. But within that ghostliness, there were lives. Real, beating, vivid lives. Dreams not yet surrendered, sorrows carefully hidden. Moments of laughter stolen like crumbs from the table. And as the day wore on, as sunlight filtered through high windows and dust shimmered in golden rays, the people below stairs moved in tandem, a quiet, rhythmic ballet beneath the opulence. Little did Annie know that this particular day, so ordinary in its beginnings, would bring with it the smallest shift in her life. A note misplaced, a door left ajar, a conversation overheard, but that we shall save for another evening. The coal scuttle clanked against the stone as Annie refilled it in the yard. The morning mist still curled around the edges of the kitchen garden, clinging to the rosemary and lavender. The hedges of Graymore House loomed beyond like dark watchmen, and the sky, not yet blue, wore the faint hush of pale gray. Annie rubbed her fingers against her apron, trying to ease away the sting from the icy metal. Her breath left faint clouds before her face. Somewhere behind the hedges, the gardener was already at work. She could hear the crunch of boots on gravel and the familiar whistle, soft, tuneless, comforting. It was Mr. Little, the head gardener, who always said good morning if their paths crossed, and sometimes slipped her an apple from the trees when no one was looking. She thought of that as she carried the coal back through the scullery, past the sinks already full of steaming water and dishes to be scrubbed. Her boots left damp marks on the flagstones, but she moved quickly. The hall would need its fire relit soon, and Mr. Redgrave did not tolerate delay. By 8:30, the house was stirring above. The sound of footsteps on polished wood, the creak of doors, a bell or two ringing from rooms far away. In the servants' corridor, the bells were fixed in neat rows, each labeled in copperplate script: drawing room, Lady Marianne's bedchamber, morning room, nursery, study. When they rang, it wasn't a sound, it was a summons. Clara adjusted her cap before stepping into the morning room with the breakfast tray. Lady Marianne sat near the window, the soft light of morning warming her pale dressing gown. She didn't look up as Clara entered, only lifted one hand slightly, a signal without words. The tray was placed gently on the table beside her. China clinked softly. Clara retreated a step. Lady Marianne's fingers were long and slender, curled now around a teacup, her gaze distant. She was often quiet in the mornings, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, as if she were reading thoughts in the fog beyond the glass. Clara had learned not to speak unless spoken to. Once, long ago, she had tried to make polite conversation, a remark about the roses blooming early. Lady Marianne had replied, "That will be all, Clara," in a tone so cool it had chilled the room more than the draft ever could. Since then, Clara simply served, bowed, and stepped back into silence. In the kitchens, the mood was warmer. Mrs. Potter was giving instructions with her usual force, rattling off tasks like bullets from a rifle. "Susan, the fish for luncheon must be scaled and cleaned before 10. Annie, I want those parsnips peeled before the bell for tea. And where in heaven's name is that new meat boy? Late again. Susan gave Annie a sympathetic look as she picked up the parsnips. Her fingers were raw already, and the day had barely begun. Think the old girl ever stops talking? Susan whispered under her breath. Annie smiled faintly, but didn't reply. She liked Mrs. Potter, even when she barked orders like a general. There was something reassuring about her presence, solid, unmovable, like the hearth itself. The sound of boots echoed on the back stairwell. John again, returning from the carriage house. He ducked in through the side door, hair tousled by the wind. You'd think the horses were royalty themselves, he muttered, setting down a saddlebag on the bench. More pampering than the family get, I reckon. Mrs. Potter didn't even turn from her pastry dough. That's because the horses won't argue about their tea, she said flatly. There was a quiet ripple of laughter. Moments like these, shared glances, little jokes, were rare gifts in the rhythm of service. They helped bind the long hours together, wove threads of connection in a life often ruled by silence and formality. At 10, Mr. Redgrave made his rounds. The butler moved through the house like a shadow, his steps soundless, his gaze sharp. He inspected the silver, the linens, the flowers in their vases. Nothing escaped his notice. In the servant hall, his presence brought a hush. Everyone straightened. Idle conversation stopped. He paused beside Annie as she arranged logs by the library fireplace. You missed ash on the grate, he said without turning his head. Annie's cheeks flamed. She stooped quickly, wiping the spot with her cloth. Polish it until you can see your reflection, he added, his voice not unkind but firm. Yes, Mr. Redgrave. It was hard sometimes not to resent him. He seemed so still, so aloof. But Annie had once seen him linger beside the pantry when he thought no one watched, speaking gently to the kitchen cat who had a limp. There was more to him, perhaps, than met the eye. By noon, the household was in its full daylight order. Upstairs, the family had settled into their morning routines, letters, reading, visits to the conservatory. Downstairs, the rhythm never stopped. Lunch was being prepared. Fish, Mrs. Potter said, and bread rolls, and syllabub if there was time. Clara was ironing linens for the afternoon tea service. John carried trunks up from the cellar at Lord Halcomb's request, grumbling beneath his breath about backaches and spoiled noblemen. And Annie found herself in the library again, restacking books after a morning meeting. The fire she had tended earlier now glowed warm and red in the hearth. It was a beautiful room, oak-paneled, full of quiet, the scent of leather and paper, polish and smoke. A place where for a moment she could breathe. She had just turned toward the doorway when she noticed something strange. A letter. It had slipped from between two volumes on the desk. Its corner peeked out, half tucked beneath a volume of political essays. Curiosity caught her. She glanced at the door, then stepped forward, lifting it gently. It was addressed not to Lord Halcombe, nor to any member of the family. It bore no seal, no return mark, just a single name in unfamiliar script. Elspeth, not a servant, not someone she knew. The handwriting was elegant, fluid, the paper thick and expensive. It felt out of place here, as though it didn't belong. Annie hesitated. She knew she shouldn't read it. Servants did not pry into their master's affairs, but something about the letter seemed out of time, as if it had waited for her, for just this moment. Footsteps in the hall startled her. She tucked the letter back between the books, heart pounding, and turned quickly to gather her cloth and coal bucket. That night, when the house was dark and only the creak of the timbers kept her company in bed, Annie thought of that name again. Elspeth. It lingered in her mind like a whisper at the edge of a dream. The next morning began as they all did, with the bell. Its sharp chime shattered the silence of the servants' corridor just before 5:30. In the dimness of her small room, Annie sat up, rubbing her eyes, still half in the strange world of sleep. The name lingered there, Elspeth, drifting just beyond the edges of thought, like mist curling at the base of a window pane. She dressed quickly, apron tied, boots pulled on tight, and stepped out into the cold hallway. As always, the floorboards beneath her feet creaked with faint protest, and the lanterns hanging along the stone corridor flickered as if yawning awake. Downstairs, the scullery was already humming. The kettle had been placed on the range, steam curling up toward the soot-stained ceiling. Mrs. Potter's voice rang out from somewhere beyond the pantry, berating the delivery boy for being late with the milk again. Annie moved with practiced speed. Her arms ached slightly from yesterday's lifting, but she said nothing. Complaining was a currency best saved for moments of real need. The memory of the letter stayed with her, its weight, its feel. She had dreamed about it the night before, though the details slipped away each time she tried to grasp them. There had been a woman, perhaps. Standing in the library, her face turned away, holding the letter close to her chest. Or had she been crying? The thought made Annie shiver, though the fire in the kitchen roared bright. As she passed the library later that morning with her scuttle of coal, she hesitated. The door was ajar. The fire had been lit earlier, and now only low embers glowed. She stepped inside quietly. The books were as she'd left them, towering shelves lining the walls, heavy curtains framing the tall windows, and the desk in the corner with its neat arrangement of writing instruments and stationery. Annie's eyes flicked toward the shelf where the letter had been. Her fingers itched to reach for it again, to confirm that she hadn't imagined the name, the paper, the script. But just as she took a step forward, a voice behind her made her heart leap. "You're not meant to be in here unaccompanied." It was Mr. Redgrave. His voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. Annie turned quickly, dropping her gaze. "I was just checking the fire, sir, making sure the coals had caught properly." There was a pause, a silence filled with the tension of a held breath. "Then, you've done your duty. Go on now." She bobbed a quick curtsy, her face burning, and left the room as quickly as she could without running. Behind her, she thought she heard the faint sound of a drawer opening. Back in the kitchen, Clara was ironing with tight, methodical movements, her lips pursed in a thin line. She looked up as Annie entered, studying her face. "You all right?" she asked. Annie nodded, dropping the coal bucket with a dull thud. "You're pale?" "Just tired." Clara went back to her ironing, but Annie could feel her watching from the corner of her eye. Clara missed little. Years of service had honed her instincts sharp as a polished knife. At 11, a visitor arrived. It was not uncommon for friends of the family to appear unannounced. But this woman, tall, thin, dressed in deep navy wool with a small black hat, was not the usual sort. She stepped out of the carriage with an air of certainty, though the name she gave to the butler was met with a flicker of surprise. "I've come to speak with Lord Halcombe," she said. "I won't keep him long." Mr. Redgrave, whose composure rarely shifted, studied her for a moment too long. "I don't believe his lordship was expecting visitors this morning," he said politely. "Tell him," she replied, "that Miss Elspeth Carroway is here." The name stopped Annie in her tracks. She had been passing through the hallway with a tray of linens, just close enough to hear. Elspeth. She kept walking, as though nothing had changed, but her heart was racing. Elspeth Carroway was not invited into the drawing room. Instead, she was escorted to the morning room, and Mr. Redgrave disappeared up the stairs with quiet urgency. Annie couldn't resist. She lingered near the base of the back stairwell, where she could listen without being seen. A whisper of voices drifted down. She could only catch snatches. "Not since Vienna." "You know why I had to." Still waiting for an explanation. Then silence. When Elspeth left an hour later, her face was pale but composed. Her steps were firm, her gloved hands folded neatly around a clutched purse. She nodded once to the footman who opened the door for her and was gone. The house seemed to breathe out once she left, as though it had been holding something in. Later, Annie passed the library again. She could have sworn the shelf had been rearranged. The books shifted, the ones that had been dusty, now cleaner than the others. The letter was gone. She told no one. Not Clara, not Susan, not even Mrs. Potter during the quiet lull of the afternoon bread making. It was her secret now, whatever it meant. That evening, as she scrubbed the scullery floor, her mind drifted. Who was Elspeth Carroway? Why had Lord Halcombe looked so pale when he emerged from the morning room? And why did a letter addressed to her lie forgotten between books? There were whispers in Greymore House, not just of gossip or imagined scandals, but of something older, something hidden. The servants knew the walls held stories. They always did. And now Annie had stepped into one. The rain came overnight. By morning, Greymore House was cloaked in mist and drizzle. The sky hung low over the hills, and the gravel drive was slick with water. Drops tapped rhythmically against the tall windows, and the scent of damp earth crept in through the stone walls. Everything was quieter, muffled, as if the weather had softened the edges of the world. Annie rose to the sound of the bell once again, her body aching more than usual. The dream had returned. Elspeth's name whispered in a voice not her own, echoing through a corridor she did not recognize. A hallway not part of the servant wing, nor of any part of the house she knew. In the stillness of the early hour, as she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, Annie wondered if the house had once looked different, if its walls had borne other names, other secrets. She pulled her hair into a tight braid and stepped out into the hall. In the scullery, the water hadn't yet boiled. Susan sat at the edge of the wooden bench, staring at nothing in particular, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her apron was clean for once and her expression unreadable. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Annie said softly. Susan didn't answer at first. Then slowly she looked up. "It's nothing." But the lie clung to her like the mist on the windows. "You sure?" "I said it's nothing," she repeated more firmly, and stood, moving to the sink. The moment passed between them like a shadow in the doorway, quick, weightless, and gone. By 7, the day's work was underway, though everything seemed to move slower in the rain. Fires needed coaxing. Floors stayed damp no matter how many times they were wiped. The kitchen smelled of wet boots and simmering porridge. Lord Halcombe did not descend for breakfast, nor did Lady Marianne. Only Miss Lydia appeared, the daughter, barely 18, wrapped in a shawl of soft blue wool. Clara served her in the morning room as always, but when she returned downstairs, she seemed different. "She asked for me," Clara said under her breath, pouring tea into her chipped mug. "Specifically." Annie raised an eyebrow. "That's not so odd." "It is. She's never once asked for anyone. Always silent, always cold. But today she looked at me like she knew me." "Maybe she's just tired." Clara shook her head. "It wasn't tiredness. It was something else, something almost frightened." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the house moving gently around them, footsteps, clinks of porcelain, a faint whistle from the kettle. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. By mid-morning, a letter arrived, delivered by hand, not post. The boy who brought it wore a long black coat and said little. The seal was unfamiliar, a deep burgundy wax with a strange curving mark pressed into it. Not quite a crest, not quite a symbol. Mr. Redgrave took it silently and disappeared up the stairs. John, polishing the banister in the front hall, watched with narrowed eyes. "Odd," he murmured later. "The way he held it, like it was something dangerous." "It's just a letter," Clara said. No, it was more than that. In the laundry room, Annie worked alongside the other girls, scrubbing collars and cuffs, rinsing soap from heavy skirts, hanging linens to dry on long wooden frames. The scent of lye filled the room, and the warmth of steam made her lightheaded. But she couldn't stop thinking about the letter, and about Elspeth Carroway, the visitor, the name, the script. What connection could she have to this place? To Lord Halcombe? When the bell rang for afternoon tea, Annie took the tray up herself, a job usually reserved for Clara. But today, Mr. Redgrave had asked for a change. No explanation, just a quiet instruction passed down without expression. The drawing room was dim, the curtains half drawn, the scent of roses and lemon polish thick in the air. Lady Marianne sat by the fireplace, a book in her lap. She didn't look up as Annie entered. Miss Lydia stood by the window, her face pale, eyes following the rain as it traced paths down the glass. Annie moved carefully, placing the tray on the low table. As she turned to leave, Lydia's voice stopped her. "You're the one from the library." Annie froze. Yes, miss." "You touched something that wasn't yours." The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to hush. Annie's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly. Lydia was looking at her, not accusingly, but with something else in her gaze. Something like sorrow. "I didn't mean." Lydia raised a hand. "It doesn't matter. It always finds someone." Lady Marianne turned a page without comment, as if she hadn't heard. Annie curtsied and backed out of the room, heart pounding. The door clicked shut behind her. In the hallway, she pressed her back to the wall and breathed in slow, shallow gulps. The world seemed tilted. Nothing was quite as it should be. Later, in the servants' hall, the air was thick with questions. The strange letter, Miss Lydia's words. The visitor, Elspeth, whom no one had seen before and whom no one had spoken of since. That evening, after supper, Annie found herself walking the back corridor that led to the unused wing of the house, a place most of the servants avoided. It was colder there, darker. The lamps hadn't been lit and the wallpaper peeled in places. A long row of doors stretched ahead, most of them locked. At the very end, one door stood slightly ajar. She paused. There was no reason to open it. She had work to do, laundry to finish, boots to scrub, and yet she stepped forward and pushed it gently. Inside was a room thick with dust and quiet. Covered furniture loomed like ghosts. In the corner stood a mirror, old and cracked, its surface fogged. A book lay open on a writing desk, pages yellowed with time, and there on the windowsill, a single sheet of paper. Annie crossed the room, her feet soundless on the worn carpet. The paper fluttered slightly in the draft. It was a page torn from a diary. April 14th, 1893. Elspeth is gone. The house feels hollow. The corridors carry her footsteps, though she no longer walks them. I saw her once in the mirror, just a glimpse, but I know it was her. She is waiting. For what, I do not know. Annie stared at the words, her hands trembling. The rain tapped against the glass. Far below, a bell rang for supper. She folded the page carefully, tucked it into her apron, and stepped out of the room, her heart no longer beating just for herself. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a hush so complete it seemed unnatural. Graymore House woke slowly. The bell rang at its usual time, but its echo felt gentler somehow, absorbed by the dampness still clinging to the stone. Rainwater dripped in lazy rivulets down the ivy-covered walls, and the garden paths shone dark with moisture. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, soot, and chimney smoke. Annie rose in silence. She had barely slept. The diary page burned a quiet presence in her apron pocket, though she had hidden it carefully beneath her pillow for the night. She had read it again and again by candlelight, tracing each letter as though it held a secret code. Elspeth is gone, but she hadn't gone far. Annie felt that with the kind of certainty one cannot explain. Elspeth was close, somehow stitched into the house itself, in its creaking floorboards, its faded wallpaper, its mirrors. As Annie dressed, she caught her reflection in the cracked glass of her wardrobe's mirror. Her eyes looked different, older, not with age, but with awareness, as though she had stepped into something vast and unseen and now it watched her back. Downstairs, the kitchen was already full of movement. Mrs. Potter barked orders as usual, her sleeves rolled, flour dusting her hair. Clara and Susan moved briskly between the counters, collecting dishes and preparing trays. The heat of the ovens pushed back against the damp chill that clung to everything. "You're late," Mrs. Potter said without looking up. Annie mumbled an apology and reached for her scuttle. The morning passed in a blur of work. Boots to be scrubbed, fireplaces to be cleaned, breakfast trays to be prepared and lifted carefully upstairs. The family seemed quieter than usual. Lord Halcombe appeared briefly in the drawing room, a cup of black coffee in his hand, eyes shadowed with something unreadable. He said little to anyone. His gaze lingered once on Annie as she passed him in the corridor, but he said nothing. Miss Lydia did not leave her room. Lady Marianne walked the gallery in silence, her slippered feet making almost no sound on the polished floor. By noon, a tension had settled over the household. Even the staff seemed to feel it. John broke a teacup in the pantry. Susan cut her finger while slicing bread. Clara spilled a pitcher of milk in the hallway and didn't speak for nearly an hour afterward. The stillness was unnatural. Not the calm of routine, but something brittle. Something waiting to shatter. When her tasks allowed, Annie slipped back into the unused wing. The room where she had found the diary page felt colder now. The dust disturbed from the night before had not resettled, and the imprint of her palm was still visible on the windowsill. She stood for a moment in the doorway, unsure whether to go further. She had half expected the page to be gone. Perhaps that would have been easier. Perhaps she would have blamed it on a dream, but it was real, folded, hidden, heavy with implication. She stepped inside, drawn again to the desk. This time, she opened the drawer. Inside were loose papers, scraps of writing, sketches, notes in the same flowing hand as the diary page, a lock of hair tied with blue ribbon, a pressed flower, dry and crumbling, and beneath it all, a small black leather-bound book. Annie hesitated, then she lifted it free. The cover bore no name. The pages smelled faintly of lavender and ash. She opened to the first page, heart hammering. This is not a diary. That was all. She turned to the next page. They told me I should forget, but I cannot. I remember the laughter in the garden, the evenings in the library, the way the candlelight made the mirror shine like silver. I remember the sound of his voice. I remember the promise. I remember the lie. Another page. He said the house belonged to me, that it would always keep me safe, that I would be mistress here, but he lied. He gave me a room and locked the door. He told the staff I was unwell. He told his wife I was dead. Annie closed the book, her breath caught in her throat. Footsteps. She froze. They were soft, careful, moving down the corridor outside. She pressed herself against the edge of the desk, ears straining. The footsteps passed. She waited a moment, then slipped the book into the folds of her apron and crept back into the hall, her back tight with tension. Back in the kitchen, the world carried on. Soup boiled on the stove. Bread rose in warm cloth-covered bowls. The familiar noises and smells of the below-stairs life offered a strange sort of comfort. The house might be holding its breath, but the work never stopped. She stowed the book in a corner of the laundry room behind a stack of folded sheets. Somewhere she knew it would be safe. Later that afternoon, Clara caught her by the stairwell. "You've been disappearing," she said quietly. "I haven't." "You have." Clara's tone wasn't accusing, just tired. "I know you're chasing something. I've seen that look before." Annie didn't reply. "Just be careful," Clara added. "This house, it remembers, sometimes more than we do." That night, the corridor outside Annie's room felt colder than usual. The lamps flickered as she passed, and the silence hummed, thick with invisible weight. She carried the black book back to her room and laid it under her mattress, hand resting briefly on its cover. When she finally lay down, sleep did not come easily, and when it did, the dream returned. This time, the hallway was clearer, long, dark, lit by flickering candlelight. At the end of it stood a woman in a high-necked dress, her face pale, her eyes heavy with sadness. She raised one hand and pointed to a door. Behind the door, the sound of a piano, soft, mournful. Then a voice, his voice. "You were never meant to be part of this." Annie woke, breath caught in her chest, heart pounding. She sat upright in the darkness, her hand reaching for the book beneath her mattress. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, and Graymore House listened. The next day began not with the usual bell, but with silence. A deep, curious silence that clung to the halls like fog. For the first time since Annie had entered service at Graymore House, the morning bell failed to ring. At first, she thought she had overslept. She jolted upright, heart thudding, but the corridor outside her room remained quiet. No footsteps, no rustle of aprons, no hiss of kettle or murmur of voices. She dressed quickly, fumbling with her laces, and stepped into the hallway. No one. The lamps along the corridor flickered weakly, their oil running low. The stillness unnerved her, not the peaceful kind that came with early morning, but something heavier, ominous. Downstairs, the scullery was cold. The fire hadn't been lit. The range sat empty, no kettle, no smoke. The kitchen smelled of damp stone and nothing more. She found Clara in the pantry, pale and trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What happened?" Annie asked. Clara didn't answer right away. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something beyond the pantry door. "I heard her," she whispered. "Heard who?" "She was in the hall last night. After we all turned in, her steps were slow, like she was walking underwater. I thought it was someone going up to check on the baby, maybe Lady Marianne. But when I looked out," Clara swallowed. "There was no one." Annie stepped closer. "You're sure?" "She was humming," Clara said, voice like glass. Not loud, just under her breath. A tune I didn't know. I waited, thought maybe she'd come down the stairs, but no one did. And the air, Annie, it was so cold, like the kitchen garden in January. Annie remembered the dream, the hallway, the flickering candlelight, the piano. "She's not imagining it," a voice said behind them. John stood in the doorway, arms folded, his face uncharacteristically grim. "I heard it too," he said. "The music." They all stood in silence for a moment, the pantry crowded with breath and unspoken fear. Then Mrs. Potter's voice rang out from the far end of the kitchen, loud and firm as always. "Enough of that ghost talk," she snapped, though there was a tremor beneath her tone. "You'll have the younger ones jumping at shadows. There's work to be done." But when Annie looked closely, she saw that Mrs. Potter hadn't yet tied her apron, and her hands, usually so sure, trembled slightly as she reached for the bread dough. The rest of the morning passed in strange disarray. Tasks were done, but without rhythm. Dishes clattered more often. Boots were polished and repolished, as if the motion itself might ward off unease. Even Mr. Redgrave seemed distracted. He left the breakfast table without speaking and retreated to the wine cellar, where he stayed for nearly an hour. The family, for their part, remained above stairs. Miss Lydia did not descend. Lady Marianne stayed in the conservatory, and Lord Halcombe remained shut away in his study, the door firmly closed. It was not until just past noon that the first real disturbance came. Susan, sent to air out the east corridor, returned ashen-faced. "There's something scratched on the nursery door," she said, voice shaking. "It wasn't there yesterday." Annie and Clara followed her up the narrow stairs. The nursery sat unused, empty now for nearly 3 years, since the death of the Halcombes' youngest son, Thomas. The door was always kept closed. No one cleaned it except once a month, by routine. But today the air outside the door felt colder. The scratch marks were deep, gouged into the wood like fingernails dragged across in desperation. They weren't fresh, but neither were they aged. 4 long, uneven lines, as though someone or something had clawed to be let in or out. John appeared a moment later, staring in silence. "No one's touched this room," he said. "Mr. Rock Redgrave has the only key," Clara murmured. "He wouldn't. No, he wouldn't." They stood there a long while, uncertain. The house seemed to be watching them, holding its breath. Later in the laundry room, Annie retrieved the black book again. She waited until she was alone, then opened to the page she had last read. "He said I must remain out of sight, that I brought shame. But I was the one he loved first, before the name, before the fortune, before her." Another page. "She came into my room one night. Her eyes were like knives. She said I would not last, that the house would consume me the way it had consumed others. I laughed at her. I should not have." And beneath it, a scrawled note in darker ink, written hastily. "If anyone finds this, do not speak the name aloud. She listens." Annie stared at the ink, her breath shallow. The name, Elspeth. She had said it more than once now, whispered it, dreamed it. She pressed her hands against the book, as though she could trap the word inside it. That evening, the house returned to something close to normal. The bells rang. Supper was served. The fire was stoked to a healthy glow. But the silence remained under the surface, like the current beneath still water. Annie sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the far wall. The mirror across from her reflected her figure, small and still in the candlelight. She did not notice at first the second shape, faint, pale, standing just beyond her shoulder, not moving, not breathing, a woman. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. The mirror, when she looked again, showed only herself. She blew out the candle and lay back, the mattress cool beneath her, eyes wide open, listening. Somewhere in the darkened corridors of Bringmore House, a soft humming had begun, a lullaby in a key no one had sung for years. The next morning broke with a pale, indifferent sun. It filtered weakly through the high windows of Graymore House, lighting the fine dust that hovered over every surface, swirling in lazy, golden spirals. Birds did not sing. The wind had grown still. The silence pressed against the walls like another layer of wallpaper, soft but inescapable. Annie moved as if in a trance, brushing her hair into its usual tight plait, fingers trembling slightly at the roots. She had barely slept. The image of the mirror lingered in her thoughts. The ripple, the handprint, the voice that wasn't quite a whisper and wasn't quite a thought. Downstairs, the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and boiled tea. Mrs. Potter had lit every stove in the kitchen, despite the mild weather, and the heat was oppressive. She said nothing to Annie when she entered, just nodded once in acknowledgement and returned to her chopping board. John stood at the corner, arms folded, his face lined with worry. "She's not come out," he said in a low voice. "Who?" "Miss Lydia. Her tray from last night, untouched, door locked, blinds drawn. Lady Marianne says she's been resting, but..." He trailed off. "But..." There was always a but now. "I could hear something," he added after a moment, "in the corridor. Not crying exactly, more like singing, but soft, off tune, like someone half remembered the melody." Annie felt it too, that sense of unraveling. The house was a tapestry, once whole, now fraying at the edges. Each day another thread came loose. And yet, the life of the household continued. It had to. The rhythm of service didn't bend for ghosts. By midday, the usual order of things had slipped again. The linen that was to be pressed and folded for Lady Marianne's drawing room tea had vanished. Clara searched the laundry, the upstairs cupboard, even beneath the bed skirts in the guest chambers. Nothing. It was just here, she muttered, pulling open drawers that hadn't been touched in weeks. I ironed it myself, starched it, folded it into fours like she likes. I swear I did. Maybe someone moved it, Annie offered gently. Clara shook her head. No one would dare, not with her initials embroidered. By 3 o'clock, the linen reappeared, laid out neatly on the floor of the unused West Wing corridor, perfectly folded, untouched by dust or damp. No footprints near it, no signs of how it had arrived. Mrs. Potter refused to speak of it. John cursed under his breath. Clara crossed herself for the first time Annie had ever seen. That evening, after the dinner rush, Annie returned to the laundry to collect a dry apron. The sky outside the window had turned the color of tarnished brass. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered like an old man clearing his throat. She hesitated before retrieving the black book from beneath the pile of folded sheets. Part of her didn't want to look again. Another part, something deeper, more primal, knew she had no choice. She flipped to the last marked page. A new entry had appeared. It hadn't been there before. The ink was faint, water-stained. The edges of the page were curled. I begged him to let me leave. He said the scandal would be too great, that his wife would understand, in time, that I should be patient. But patience is a cage made of words. Another page. There is a door in the cellar, bricked over. Behind it, the room where he kept my letters, my journals, my name. He said no one would look there, that no one would find the pieces. The cellar. Annie had only been there twice since starting at Graymore. It was not part of her regular duties, and most avoided it. The floor was uneven, the walls wept, and the light from the small, grimy windows barely reached past the stairs. That night, after the supper trays were cleared and the last boots shined, Annie waited. When the others had turned in, she took a lantern from the hook by the kitchen door and made her way to the cellar stairs, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The air grew colder with each step down. The scent of mildew and old coal filled her nose. The cellar was just as she remembered, low-ceilinged, with shelves of canned goods and wine bottles covered in dust. Rusted hooks still hung from the beams. The floor was dirt and stone, and beyond the far wall, just where the curve of the foundation met the slope of the ground, stood an old section of brick, newer, smoother, a strange square of patchwork against the age-worn stone. Annie approached slowly. The bricks were pale, unweathered by time. They looked wrong, out of place. She crouched and ran her fingers along the edges. Mortar crumbled beneath her touch. It had been sealed hastily, sloppily. As she pressed harder, a hollow sound echoed behind it. A cavity. She stood and grabbed the handle of an old iron coal scoop, prying at the edge. One brick gave way with a dull pop, then another. A small hole opened, just wide enough to see beyond. The lantern's glow pierced the gap, revealing darkness. Then the edge of a wooden shelf. Dust floated within, thick and undisturbed. And there, barely visible, were papers, bundles of them. She widened the hole until her arm could reach through, fingertips brushing against a pile. She pulled a handful out. Letters, journals, drawings, all in the same familiar hand. Elspeth's. She backed away slowly, the papers trembling in her grip. She did not read them yet. She did not dare, not here, not now. She slipped them into her apron and replaced the bricks as best she could, heart pounding. As she turned to leave, the cellar behind her darkened, as if the lantern's light had been swallowed. At the top of the stairs, she looked back once. A figure stood at the edge of the brick wall, not moving, just watching. The papers remained hidden beneath Annie's mattress for 2 full days before she dared look at them. She hadn't spoken of the cellar to anyone, not even Clara. There was a heaviness in the house now, and Annie feared that even breathing Elspeth's name aloud might disturb something deeper, something that listened through the walls, waited in the cold corners, pressed its breath against the glass at night. So she worked, silently, carefully, her days a performance of normalcy, scrubbing floors, polishing brass, carrying trays of silver and porcelain up and down the great staircase. Her feet ached, her hands cracked and stung, but the pain grounded her, kept her in this world, not the one that flickered just beyond mirrors and half-open doors. but the papers called to her. And when the evening of the third day arrived, quiet, windless, with no stars above, she finally gave in. In her small room, candlelight casting soft shadows across the narrow bed, Annie unfolded the first of Elspeth's hidden letters. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the writing remained elegant, precise. The hand of someone who had once believed in the permanence of words. To him, I was only ever a silence to be buried beneath music and marble. He promised me the world but gave me a locked room and a window that never opened. Every gift was a chain, every kiss a seal. I did not understand it then. I do now. The next letter bore no date. Only a smudged corner and a single line. They said she would be kind, that Lady Marianne had a generous heart, but her kindness has teeth. Annie's breath caught. She read another. He comes to the room only at night now, says it's safer that way, that Marianne suspects. I hear her on the stairs sometimes. She stops at my door but never knocks. The house shifts when she's near, as if it remembers what he wants to forget. And then, there is a key beneath the third stone in the hearth. I buried it after the second time she struck me. I think she knew. I think she laughed when she poured my tea. Annie sat back, heart hammering, the papers trembling in her lap. Lady Marianne, the elegant, distant woman with her violet shawls and scent of roses. Annie had never seen her speak above a whisper. Her words were clipped, controlled. She was graceful, too graceful sometimes. And yet, the servants feared her with an unspoken reverence. Even Mr. Redgrave lowered his voice in her presence. Could it be true? Could she have known? Annie folded the letters again, tucked them beneath the mattress, and blew out the candle. She lay in the dark, eyes wide, listening. Down the corridor, someone was walking, the soft brush of slippers on stone. Then, a pause, a knock, soft, delicate. Not at Annie's door, but 2 doors down. Susan's room. Annie strained to hear. No voices followed, no further footsteps. She counted slowly in her mind, waited, but the knock did not come again. The next morning, Susan was gone. Her bed was cold. Her apron hung still on its hook. Her boots remained, damp from the previous day's cleaning, but there was no sign of her. No word. No farewell. Mrs. Potter said she'd taken ill and been sent to stay with a cousin in the village. But no carriage had arrived. No footman had fetched her. Her satchel lay untouched beneath her bed. She just left? Annie whispered to Clara as they scrubbed the scullery floor. Clara nodded, lips pale. That's what they say. You don't believe it. Clara looked up, eyes heavy with something older than fear. I think the house takes what it's owed. The rain returned that night. It pelted the windows and flooded the stone gutters. The eaves groaned, and the trees along the drive bent like mourners. Thunder rolled once, low, distant, and then faded. Annie waited until midnight before slipping into the east wing again. The music room was locked. The mirror above the fireplace now bore a single crack across its face, like a tear in still water. She knelt by the hearth, fingers searching along the edge of the stones. The third from the right, smooth, cold. She pressed hard. It gave way slightly, loose in its bed of mortar. Beneath it, wrapped in cloth the color of faded ashes, was the key. Brass, worn smooth by time and touch. Annie turned it over in her palm. There were doors in the house that hadn't been opened in decades. Rooms sealed for renovation that never came. Cupboards with locks that had long since lost their purpose. But one room came to mind immediately. The room at the far end of the servants' corridor. The one no one used. The one Mrs. Potter insisted remained closed. Annie had passed it hundreds of times, its frame warped slightly from age, its threshold dark. No one spoke of it. No one entered. That night, as the storm surged outside, she stood before it with the key in hand. She placed her fingers on the doorknob. It turned easily. The door creaked open, and the smell hit her first. Not of mold or dust, but lavender. Faint. Lingering. Familiar. The room was small, windowless, the walls lined in faded velvet. A single chair sat in the center, facing a writing desk. On the desk, papers, a quill, a broken teacup, its rim stained dark. And on the far wall, covering nearly the entire length, a mirror. Not cracked, not tarnished. Perfect. Its surface shimmered with a pale light, though no candle burned. Annie stepped forward, her reflection followed, and just behind her in the mirror, not in the room, stood a second figure. Elspeth, eyes full of sorrow, lips parted in warning, one hand raised, pointing, not at Annie, at the floor. Annie looked down. There where the wood had warped from unseen damp lay a faint outline, a trapdoor. The wood beneath Annie's feet was warped and discolored, but the outline of the trapdoor was unmistakable, subtle, yes, and worn by years of time and careful concealment, yet once seen, impossible to forget. A thin seam traced a rectangle no larger than a coffin lid. Her breath caught. She knelt and ran her fingers along the edge. Dust clung to her skin, mingling with the faint dampness of the boards. There was no handle, no hinge visible, only the shallow indentation of a long-forgotten groove. But when she pressed her palm to it, something yielded. A soft click, muted by age. Then a whisper of air escaped from the space beneath, cool and still and old. She hesitated. Behind her, the mirror remained still. No flicker, no movement. Elspeth was gone, or at least hidden again behind the shimmer of silver glass. But the image of her face, the sorrow in her gaze, lingered in Annie's mind. She slid her fingers into the groove and pulled. The wood groaned in protest. Dust rose like smoke. Beneath the trapdoor lay a shallow stairwell of stone, slick with moss and lined with darkness. It descended at a sharp angle, too narrow to be part of the original foundation. This had not been made by the house's builders, she thought. This had been added later, dug into the bones of the manor like a secret incision. Annie lit her lantern with trembling hands. The flame flared, then settled, casting flickering gold down the narrow stairs. The scent was stronger now, not decay, but time, dry earth, cold stone, a faint trace of old perfume. Lavender again, always lavender. Step by step, she descended. The air grew colder, the silence thickened. Her breath echoed too loudly in the tunnel, each inhale and exhale bouncing off unseen corners. Her boots slipped once on the damp stone, and she caught herself against the wall. The chill bled through the cloth of her sleeves, reaching her skin like icy fingers. After what felt like an eternity compressed into moments, the stairwell opened into a small chamber. She stepped inside. It was no larger than a linen closet, with walls of rough-hewn stone and a low ceiling that forced her to stoop. But within the cramped space was a strange kind of reverence, like a chapel buried underground. On one wall hung a portrait. Elspeth, not as Annie had seen her in mirrors or dreams, but as she had once been in life, radiant, vibrant, her dark hair pinned with pearls, her eyes calm but curious. She wore a blue silk gown, the folds of it painted with such skill that they seemed to shimmer even in the lantern light. Beneath the portrait stood a small wooden table. Upon it lay a book, bound in deep green leather. Next to it, a dried rose, perfectly preserved, its petals the color of blood. Annie reached for the book. It bore no title. She opened it carefully, the spine cracking softly. The first page was blank. The second bore a line written in that same unmistakable hand. "If you have found this, then the house has chosen you." She turned the page. "They kept me here." The words were uneven, scratched rather than written, as though carved by desperation more than ink. Not in body, but in memory. I am part of the walls, the mirror, the halls. Not because I wish to stay, but because he would not let me leave. He built this place over me. Annie swallowed. Her lantern flickered. He said it was for my own good, that the scandal would ruin him, that no one would understand. He told the others I had run away, that I'd gone abroad. But the truth lives here, hidden, buried. She turned another page, a sketch. Crude, pencil on paper, it showed a hallway, one Annie recognized instantly. The east wing, the same pattern of carpet, the narrow windows. But in the drawing, the hallway ended in a door that no longer existed. And scrawled beneath the sketch, "Behind the blue velvet," always behind the blue. Annie closed the book slowly, her fingers numb. Behind the blue velvet. There was only one room in Greymore House where blue velvet adorned the walls. The family drawing room. The grand one. The one used only for winter evenings and important guests. A place the servants rarely entered. And in that room, a single stretch of blue drapery hung behind the piano. Pointless, it had always seemed, as there were no windows along that wall. Annie stood in the stone chamber, the lantern casting long shadows behind her. She could feel the heartbeat of the house above her, each creak and moan of timber like a pulse. A living thing, watching, waiting. She took one last look at Elspeth's portrait. Her painted eyes no longer seemed to gaze outward, but inward, as if aware of Annie's presence, grateful perhaps, or simply resigned. Then Annie turned, climbed the stairs, and replaced the trapdoor. The mirror no longer shimmered. It reflected only the room and her within it. Back in her narrow bed, the letters clutched tight beneath her pillow, Annie lay with eyes wide open. Behind the blue velvet, she would go tomorrow. She had to know. Dawn broke with a smear of pale gold over the eastern hills, but Graymore House remained wrapped in shadow. A heavy mist clung to the lawns, rising in slow, curling waves, muffling sound and swallowing distance. The house stood at its heart like a slumbering beast, its windows shuttered, its chimneys breathing faint tendrils of smoke into the cold morning air. Annie moved through her duties with a quiet, deliberate pace. Her mind was far from her hands, though they scrubbed and wiped and polished with practiced efficiency. She filled scuttles with coal, folded linens with exact corners, arranged breakfast trays with steadiness born of repetition. But all the while, her thoughts hovered in a single place, the drawing room, the velvet drape, behind the blue. At 10:30, Lady Marianne descended the staircase. She wore a pale green dress, high-necked and buttoned to the chin, and a shawl of fine lace over her shoulders. Her steps were precise, her face unreadable. She gave no indication that the air in the house was any different, that something beneath their feet stirred, or that the past pressed against the walls like rising damp. She passed Annie without a glance. Clara caught her arm later in the hallway near the scullery. "You're going to the drawing room," Clara said, not a question. Annie hesitated. "Yes." "There's something there, isn't there? Something you need to see." Annie nodded once. Clara didn't ask what. She only said, "Be careful." The drawing room was not in use that day. The family had taken tea in the morning room instead. The door stood closed, the brass handle slightly cool beneath Annie's fingers. She glanced once over her shoulder, then slipped inside. The room greeted her like an old, forgotten chapel. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, spilling onto the carpet in narrow bars. Dust motes drifted in the air, caught in the golden light. The furniture was arranged perfectly. The rosewood armchairs, the grand piano in the corner, the tall hearth unlit but swept clean. And at the far end of the room, the wall hung with blue velvet. It reached from ceiling to floor, rich and heavy. It was unlike any of the other furnishings in the house, more dramatic, more theatrical. Annie had dusted its hem before, but never touched it. Servants were not to disturb decorative drapery, but she was no longer just a servant. She crossed the room, her boots silent on the thick rug. Her heart pounded, louder with every step. When she reached the velvet, she reached up and pressed her fingers into the fold near the center. There was something behind it, solid, cold, a wall, deeper than that. She pulled gently and the fabric came away, revealing a narrow panel of wood. Not painted, not wallpapered, just smooth oak, set flush with the wall. She ran her hand along it, seeking an edge. Her fingers caught on a groove, a hidden seam. The panel moved with a creak, just enough to reveal a gap. Annie slipped her fingers into it and pulled. The panel opened inward like a small door. A corridor, dark, narrow, hidden. The air that escaped was dry and thin, like breath held too long. It smelled of time and old wood and the faint, unmistakable trace of lavender. She stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a soft click. Darkness swallowed her. She lit her lantern, its flame trembling. The narrow passage extended ahead of her in a slight curve, its walls unfinished, its floor packed earth. She moved forward, her steps careful, the echo of her breath the only sound. The walls were lined with what looked like paintings. No, not paintings. Sketches, dozens of them, some framed, some pinned directly to the wooden beams, all in the same hand. Elspeth's. Faces, rooms, shadows. Many were incomplete. Some had been smeared as if by tears. Others were crossed out with furious lines, their subjects obscured. But one sketch caught Annie's eye. It was of Lady Marianne. Not as she was now, but younger, her features sharper, her eyes harder, her mouth drawn in a cruel line. Beside her, scrawled in hasty script, she knew. She always knew. Annie moved past it, heart racing. At the end of the corridor, the passage opened into a hidden chamber. This one was larger than the others she had found, octagonal, with stone walls and a domed ceiling. A stained glass window, hidden from outside, cast red and violet patterns onto the floor, though no light source was visible. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it, a box. Simple, wooden, unlocked. Annie approached. Inside, she found a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, a small velvet pouch, and a single gold ring with an opal stone set in its center. She unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was not Elspeth's. It was Lord Halcombe's. My dearest, you must understand, it was never meant to be this way. I loved you. I still do. But Marianne has power beyond what you know. She is not just my wife. She is my punishment. She sees everything. She whispers to the house and it listens. I cannot save you, not anymore. But I have hidden this for you. It is not justice. It is not enough. But it is all I can give. Annie's hands shook. She looked down at the pouch and opened it. Inside were fragments of a broken locket, porcelain and gold, and a miniature painting shattered clean down the middle, showing a man's face, half lost to the crack. Annie knew who it was. She returned the pouch to the box and turned back toward the passage. But something had changed. The corridor behind her now breathed, not with sound, but with presence. The shadows on the wall moved just slightly, as if watching, and far away, back through the velvet panel, the piano began to play, a single note, then another, low, slow, repeating, Elspeth's melody, calling her back. The sound of the piano echoed faintly through the corridor as Annie made her way back, clutching the box to her chest. The melody was halting, uneven, as though someone with no memory of music were feeling their way along forgotten keys. She paused once, her breath caught in her throat, and listened. The same three notes repeated, low, low, higher. A question, unspoken, a beckoning. Her lantern flickered, casting restless shadows across the rough walls. The sketches seemed to shift around her, those paper faces watching, silent witnesses to a story buried too long. She quickened her pace, passing Elspeth's portrait, the cruel drawing of Lady Marianne, and dozens of unnamed figures fading into charcoal smudges. When Annie reached the end of the corridor and pushed open the hidden panel behind the velvet, the grand drawing room was empty. The piano was still, the keys untouched. She stepped into the space with care, the box cradled in her arms. The drape fell closed behind her, sealing the secret once again. Dust swirled in the fading afternoon light, and her boots stirred a faint echo on the carpet. She crossed the room, half expecting someone to call out, to stop her. No one did. Upstairs, the house had grown restless. That evening, the wind rose. It howled around the chimneys and through the eaves, rattling window panes and making the timbers groan. Fires were stoked high, the curtains drawn early. The servants moved more quickly, their voices hushed, their eyes turned often to the doorways they passed. Graymore House seemed to be leaning in on itself, shrinking, folding inward. By supper, it was clear something had changed. Mr. Redgrave's usual composure had frayed. He moved with less precision, his words clipped. He snapped at John over the placement of the wine decanter, then apologized moments later without explanation. Mrs. Potter dropped a plate in the kitchen, a fine one, marked with the Halcombe crest, and when it shattered, she simply stared at the pieces as if they were speaking to her. Clara found Annie outside the scullery, alone, staring out the narrow window at the dark lawn. I know you found something, Clara said quietly. Annie didn't answer. Clara continued. The bells. They've been ringing at the wrong times. Rooms that haven't been used in years. The old nursery again. The morning room twice last night. Annie turned to her. What do you think is happening? Clara's face was pale but calm. I think she's waking. Who? Elspeth. The word hung in the air between them. Clara didn't ask how Annie knew her name. Didn't ask how she had known to say it. That night, after the others had gone to bed, Annie returned to her room and laid the contents of the box carefully across her quilt. The letters, the pouch, the ring, the broken locket. She studied the ring first. The opal shimmered faintly in the lamplight, catching colors that weren't quite there. Fire and ice, stormlight. Beneath the surface, it seemed to breathe. She slipped it on her finger. A jolt, not painful but sudden, a drop in pressure, a shift in the room's weight. Her lamp guttered once. She sat still, waiting. Nothing more came. Then she picked up the locket pieces. The porcelain face, Lord Halcombe's, was unmistakable in one fragment. The other half was smeared with something dark, ink, perhaps, or smoke. She could just make out a woman's hair, the curl of a lip. It had been a portrait of two, lovers, posed in secret. Her hand brushed one of the letters again. She came into the corridor last night. I heard her. She wore my perfume, my gown, but it wasn't me. I watched her pass my door and knew she wanted them to believe I'd left. He found the locket beside her bed the next morning. I never saw it again. Annie folded the letter shut. Outside her room, the wind struck the side of the house in a sudden gust. and for a brief second, the candle in her lamp flickered nearly out. And then the bell. Not the morning bell, not the servant bell. The bell for the upper corridor, the one outside Lord Halcombe's study. It rang once, paused, then rang again. She opened her door, heart hammering, and stepped into the hallway. Clara was already there, standing barefoot in her shift, her face ghost pale. You heard it? Annie nodded. Neither spoke. The two girls moved together through the silent house, up the back stairs, past the velvet-carpeted landing, and toward the hallway that led to the study. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows longer. The flickering gas lamps along the corridor cast light that seemed to sway too slowly, as though struggling against a hidden current. They reached the top step. The door to the study was ajar. Annie pushed it gently open. The room beyond was untouched, books neatly shelved, the fireplace glowing low, a glass of brandy on the desk untouched, and beside the desk stood Lord Halcombe, still, rigid. His eyes were open, but not in surprise nor fear, in recognition, as if he had been waiting. And beside him, barely visible in the glow of the fire, stood a woman. She was not solid, not quite, but neither was she transparent. She wore a gown of soft blue silk. Her hands were folded. Her face, half in shadow, bore no anger, only grief. Elspeth, Lord Halcombe whispered. She said nothing. But the mirror behind the desk began to ripple, slowly, deeply, like the surface of a pond stirred by a long-forgotten stone, and from within it the music started again, the same three notes, and then a fourth, higher, resolute. The fourth note echoed long after it ended. It rang through the study like a bell tolling in reverse, calling not the living, but something long laid down. The silence that followed was deep and deliberate, as though the house itself were waiting for someone to speak first. Annie stepped further into the room. The fire crackled softly, casting orange flickers across the bookshelves and catching the glint of brass in the frame of the mirror. Clara followed, her breath shallow, eyes fixed not on Lord Halcombe, but on the woman beside him, the presence wrapped in blue silk, motionless and mute, like a memory wearing flesh. Elspeth. She did not move. She did not turn. She merely stood, her gaze pinned to the man before her. Lord Halcombe had not shifted his stance since their arrival. His hands rested lightly on the edge of the desk, not clenched, not trembling. His face bore no panic, only the weariness of something too long deferred. I wondered when you'd come, he said, voice thick with something older than sorrow. Annie opened her mouth to speak, but Elspeth's hand lifted, just slightly, and he fell quiet again. You buried me with the truth, Elspeth said, her voice as soft as silk sliding from satin, and then tried to live as if I had never existed. No, Lord Halcombe's voice cracked. I tried to protect you. You protected your name. He took a step toward her. I was afraid. Yes, she whispered, and it was not contempt but pity that hung from the single word. He stopped, arms hanging limp at his sides. Behind him, the mirror shimmered again. Annie's gaze turned toward it. The silvered glass seemed to breathe, to pulse faintly. For the first time, she noticed that the frame, carved with vines and roses, bore tiny cracks at the corners, as though time had gnawed at its edges without ever quite breaking through. Elspeth, Annie said quietly, what do you want us to do? The woman turned at last. Her face, so familiar now from dreams, from reflections, from sketches and fragments, was calm, her features soft but sharp, like a painting drawn in twilight. There's something beneath, she said. Beneath. Lord Halcombe closed his eyes. No, he murmured. Please, not that. Elspeth ignored him. In the east garden, she said, eyes on Annie. The angel leans against the stone, but beneath it lies the rest. My journal, my name, my beginning. Annie stepped forward. Why show me? Elspeth's gaze deepened. Because the house chose you. Because you see. The fire sputtered behind them, casting sparks across the hearth. Outside, the wind rose again, and in the far corridor something fell, a picture frame perhaps, or a candlestick, and shattered on the floor. Clara spoke, her voice low. What will happen if we find it? Elspeth looked to her. Then the house will remember, truly. And you. I will no longer need to remain. Lord Halcombe turned away, moving slowly to the fireplace. He stared into the embers, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight in his shoulders looked unbearable. I loved you, he whispered. And yet, Elspeth replied, you locked the door. Annie stepped back. She felt the pulse of the house. There was no other word for it, gathering, tightening, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, Elspeth, she said gently, how do we find it? In the garden, Elspeth said again, where the ivy has not grown, beneath the angel that watches with no eyes. And with that, her image faded, not into nothingness, but into stillness. She was gone. The shimmer in the mirror slowed. The music ceased. The fire died to a dull glow. Clara touched Annie's arm. You believe her? I don't need to believe, Annie replied. I already know. Lord Halcombe did not look up as they left the room. He stood in silence facing the fire, his shadow thrown tall against the bookshelf. When the door closed behind them, Annie thought she heard him begin to weep. They returned to the servants' corridor without speaking. Outside, rain had begun to fall, a soft, slow rhythm, like footsteps on a distant floor. The east garden, tucked behind a tangle of hedgerows and iron gates, had not been tended in years. Its paths were overgrown, its stone benches cracked and sagging. It was not part of the grand tours anymore. Annie stood at her window and looked into the darkness. She could just make out the statue. An angel, half consumed by moss and time, leaning against a rough stone pedestal. But its eyes were hollow, not worn down, but carved that way, waiting. She knew in that moment what she would do at first light. The rain lingered through the night, falling in steady, silken threads that stitched the garden in mist and shadow. The windows of Greymore House wept softly, and the ivy clung tighter to the stone, as though the house itself were bracing for what lay beneath. Annie didn't sleep. She lay on her side beneath the heavy covers, eyes wide, listening to the patter against the panes and the occasional groan of the old timbers. In her mind, the vision of Elspeth's face remained, serene, not angry, but resolute. The echo of her words, where the ivy has not grown, played again and again like a lullaby she could not follow to sleep. At the first gray shimmer of morning, Annie dressed in silence. She chose her oldest boots, the ones thick with scuffs and patched soles, and pulled her shawl tight across her shoulders. Her apron she folded and left behind. She would not be serving breakfast this morning. Clara met her at the back door. Neither spoke. They slipped into the garden as the mist curled low around their ankles. The path to the east garden was half hidden now, lined with boxwood that had grown wild, its scent sharp in the damp air. Moss covered the stones beneath their feet, making each step uncertain, but they moved with quiet purpose, guided more by instinct than sight. Beyond the hedgerow, the angel waited. She was taller than Annie remembered, perhaps because she had only seen her from the windows before. The stone figure leaned against her pedestal, one wing broken, the other folded like a bird sheltering from storm. Her hands were gentle. Her eye sockets, carved with eerie precision, stared into eternity. And just behind the angel, at the base of the pedestal, was a patch of earth untouched by ivy. The rest of the garden was wrapped in green, walls, benches, the wrought iron gate. But here a semicircle of bare ground remained, as though something beneath had pushed the ivy away. Annie knelt and brushed the wet leaves aside. The soil was soft from the rain. Beneath the surface, her fingers found the edge of something hard. Wood. Clara knelt beside her. They dug with bare hands, not speaking, each scoop of earth heavy with the weight of years. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the droplets clinging to their sleeves, the trembling steam of their breath. Then a box, worn but intact, no larger than a bread bin. It bore no lock, no seal, only initials faintly carved on its lid. E.C. Elspeth Carraway. Annie hesitated for the briefest moment, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilskin, tied with faded ribbon. She undid the knot. A journal rested within, its leather cover dark with age but uncracked. Next to it a pair of gloves, lace once white, now the color of old parchment, and a single pressed flower, a violet, its petals flattened and dried but still clinging to their shape. Annie opened the journal. The first page bore no writing. The second, a sketch of the east garden, just as it looked now, the angel in profile. Then came the words. This is the truth of his name whispered behind fans, not the shame buried in cellar walls. I was not mad. I was not wicked. I was silenced. He told me he would leave her, that we would run to the coast, to the cliffs beyond Dover. He bought me a ring. He wrote me poems. But when she discovered the letters, he changed. She said, if you love her, you may keep her. In the house, in the shadows, where she belongs, and he agreed. Annie's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Each one bled with grief, not melodramatic but precise. Elspeth had not lost her mind. She had lost her place, her voice, her name. There were drawings of the hallways, of the secret room behind the velvet, of the mirror that now rippled with memory. Sketches of Clara's uniform, of the bells in the servants' corridor, of Lord Halcombe always with his eyes turned away. And on the final page, if anyone finds this, know that I was not a ghost. I was a woman, and the house remembers me still. The wind stirred through the trees above them. Annie looked up to see the ivy pulling slightly at the stone around the pedestal, as if loosening. The angel's face seemed softer now in the morning light, no longer lifeless but wistful. She closed the journal and held it against her chest. Clara knelt beside her, silent. Her face was streaked with earth and tears she hadn't noticed fall. "What do we do with it?" she asked finally. "We bring it back," Annie said, "where she can be seen, where they all can know." They stood, the box between them, and made their way back through the hedgerow, past the wild garden paths and into the quiet shadow of the house. The air felt lighter somehow. Not cleansed, no, but shifted. A window cracked, a door unlocked. The house had watched them, and for the first time, it had blinked. When they returned to the servants' hall, Mrs. Potter was there, standing at the edge of the stove with a ladle in her hand, unmoving. She looked at the box, at the mud on their hems, and said only, "You found it then?" Annie nodded. Mrs. Potter closed her eyes. About time. The kitchen had never been so quiet. The clatter of pans, the hiss of the kettle, those familiar sounds that formed the rhythm of every servant's morning, were absent now. Even the ever-present ticking of the clock above the scullery door seemed slower, subdued, as if the house itself was pausing to listen. Annie stood at the center of the servants' hall, her fingers curled gently around the edges of the box. Mud clung to her skirt, dried leaves to the hem of her shawl. Clara stood beside her, pale and silent, and Mrs. Potter, still holding the iron ladle in one hand, seemed to have aged 5 years in the space of 5 minutes. "You knew," Annie said quietly. "Didn't you?" Mrs. Potter didn't answer at first. She moved to the table, set the ladle down with care, and sank into the nearest chair. Her hands trembled only slightly. "I knew a piece," she said at last, "enough to fear the rest." Annie placed the box on the table, lifting the lid with slow reverence. The scent of damp wood and lavender rose again, faint and persistent. She reached for the journal and laid it flat on the wood. The pressed violet inside shifted with the movement. Mrs. Potter's eyes fell on the gloves. "She wore those," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "On warm days with a little straw hat, used to walk the terrace before supper, humming." Clara blinked. "You saw her?" "Oh yes, I was a kitchen maid then, young, like you." She looked up at Annie. "She was kind to me, called me Miss Potter, even when no one else remembered my name." "Why didn't you speak of her?" Annie asked. "Because the house punished those who did." Annie's breath caught. "She vanished one night," Mrs. Potter continued. "There were whispers. Upstairs they said she had run off, that she was unwell, but no one truly believed it. We all felt it. The silence she left behind wasn't ordinary. It was heavy, like a door had closed and locked from the inside." Clara stepped forward. "And Lord Halcombe?" Mrs. Potter's face darkened. "He said little, grew quieter, more rigid. Lady Marianne was always distant, but after that, she was like stone, cold and smooth and impossible to read." Annie ran a hand over the journal's cover. "She's still here," she said. "Not just in the mirrors, not just in the walls, in this, in what was hidden." Mrs. Potter nodded slowly. "Then it's time to unhide her." They looked at one another. A quiet understanding passed between them. The time for silence had passed. Secrets left to fester would only poison the house further. Graymore had carried this weight too long. That afternoon, under a pewter sky, Annie climbed the main staircase for the first time, not as a servant, but as a messenger. Her hands held the journal, clean now, wrapped in cloth. She moved past the drawing room, past the velvet drapes, past the corridor where the mirror no longer shimmered. Each step was measured, steady. She paused outside the study. The door was closed. She knocked. A voice, low and tired, responded. "Come." Lord Halcombe sat behind his desk, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. The fire burned low beside him. He did not stand when Annie entered. She placed the journal on the desk, then stepped back. He looked at it for a long time before reaching out with both hands. His fingers trembled as he untied the cloth. When he saw the initials pressed into the leather, something in his face crumbled. "She wrote this," he said softly. "Yes. You've read it?" "I have." He nodded, as if he had expected no less. "She trusted you," he murmured. "I wonder what that says about the house, about me." Annie didn't answer. He opened the journal and flipped through the pages. He didn't pause at the sketches, didn't recoil at the accusations. When he reached the final page, he ran his fingertips over the line. "I was a woman." His eyes shone, but no tears fell. After a long moment, he closed the book and stood. "I will speak to them," he said. "The household, the staff, the village if I must. I will not allow her to remain a shadow." Annie watched him. "It won't erase what was done," she said gently. "No," he agreed, "but perhaps it will stop the rot." That evening, every member of the household, servant and family alike, was called to the great hall. Annie stood near the back beside Clara as the room filled with whispering footsteps and curious glances. Lord Halcombe stood before the hearth, the journal in his hands. Lady Marianne sat near the window, her face unreadable. Miss Lydia stood behind her, lips pressed tight. He told the story. Not all of it, not the mirrors, not the music, but the truth. That Elspeth Carroway had lived within these walls, that she had been loved, that she had been hidden, that her name had been silenced, and that from this day forward it would be spoken again. When he finished, no one applauded, no one moved. The house was utterly still. Then a wind stirred, soft, cool. It passed through the hall as if someone had opened a door far away, a breath, a release, and somewhere from the upper corridor a single bell rang. Not loud, not sharp, but clear, as if someone had finally been acknowledged. The days that followed moved like fog, thick with meaning, yet soft around the edges. Graymore House did not change overnight. Its corridors still creaked with age, its windows still wept when the rain came. But there was a difference in the air now, subtle as breath against a mirror. The silence had shifted. It was no longer weighted with secrets, but with listening. And the house listened. The journal remained in the library, placed openly on a side table beneath the stained glass window. A small silver plaque had been affixed to the edge of the table, engraved simply, Elspeth Carroway, 1879 to 1901, not forgotten. No one was forbidden from reading it. No pages were torn out. Servants passed it in quiet reverence. Some paused to touch the cover. A few, Clara among them, read passages late in the evening, her fingertips brushing each page as though tracing the threads of Elspeth's voice. Annie, too, returned to it often, but not out of fear or obligation. She returned as one visits a grave, to remember, to honor. And yet, as the surface of the household settled, something beneath it stirred again. It began with the bells. Not violently, not the frantic clanging that once startled them awake in the middle of the night, but with softer, stranger patterns. The nursery bell rang at dusk, though the room remained locked and untouched. The morning room bell rang twice in succession at precisely the same moment each evening, 9:14. The third bell, the one marked South Parlor, a room used only for storage now, rang once, then once again on the hour, every hour for a single night. Mr. Redgrave took to checking the bellboard personally. He would stand before it, arms folded, brow furrowed, watching the chords with the intense stillness of a man waiting for a verdict. "They've changed," he said to Annie quietly one evening. "It's not mischief. It's not mechanical." Annie didn't ask how he knew. She knew too. Then the mirror in the music room cracked. Not shattered, just a thin, branching fracture near the base, like ice forming on glass. No one had been inside. The door had been locked. Mrs. Potter swore she hadn't touched the key in weeks. But the crack was there, and in the days that followed, it grew. Annie stood before it one afternoon, tracing the hairline fracture with her eyes. In its depths, she saw not herself, but the faintest impression of a figure turning away, her back to the room, her hair unbound, her shoulders drawn in sorrow. Elspeth no longer appeared in dreams. She no longer whispered from the corners of the room or pointed from the mirror's edge. But she was not gone. The house was breathing her again. 1 week after the truth had been told, a visitor arrived. Not announced, not expected. An old man with a walking stick and a heavy black coat, stooped with age and weariness. His cab pulled up the drive just before supper, and he stood for a long time in the gravel, gazing up at the house as though reacquainting himself with something he had once known. John opened the door. The man handed him a small card. Dr. Gideon Braithwaite. Lord Halcombe descended within minutes. They spoke in the study for over an hour, the door firmly shut. The fire burned low. The servants passed by in pairs, slowing near the door, listening for raised voices. None came. Later, Annie saw Lord Halcombe standing alone in the garden, staring at the eastern hedge where the angel stood. The ivy had begun to climb it again, slowly, curling up from the base. He stood motionless, arms crossed, until the light failed. That night, the bells were silent. No footsteps in the hall. No whispers behind mirrors. Only stillness. And in the morning, the angel had been cleaned, its wings scrubbed gently, the moss cleared from its pedestal, a small wreath of white violets placed at its base. No one claimed the task, but everyone noticed. In the servants' quarters, a new kind of conversation emerged, one not in hushed tones, but in reflective ones. Annie found herself sitting with Clara and John late one evening, the three of them huddled near the scullery fire, the rest of the house asleep. They didn't speak of ghosts or hauntings or curses. They spoke of her, of who Elspeth might have been if she lived openly, of the love she carried, of the betrayal she endured. She wasn't looking to be avenged, Clara said, eyes fixed on the flames. Just remembered. She deserved more, John added, more than being hidden behind velvet and lies. Annie said nothing. She only nodded. The next morning, Clara stitched a small nameplate onto the linen closet where Elspeth's gloves had been quietly placed. EC, two simple letters. No one removed it. Even Lady Marianne passed it once in silence, her hand brushing against the brass, her mouth tight with something that might have been regret or remembrance. That night, as Annie prepared for bed, she looked into her mirror. For the first time in weeks, it reflected only her. No figure, no shimmer. Just a girl with tired eyes, a faint smear of soot on her cheek, and a life still very much her own. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands in her lap, and whispered quietly into the dim room. I remember you. A breeze stirred the candle, nothing more. But when she lay back beneath the covers, she felt something lift, as though the house had finally exhaled. The spring rains gave way slowly to pale sunlight. It crept through the high windows of Greymore House in slim golden shafts, warming the dust that had settled in corners and brightening the stone floors that had for so long known only shadows. The ivy on the east garden wall grew softer, greener, curling not with menace, but with life. Inside, the house moved with the quiet rhythm of recovery. Rooms once locked remained open. The nursery, long sealed, was aired and cleaned. Annie stood in the doorway one morning, watching Clara lay fresh linens in the cradle that would never be used again. The wallpaper, though faded, still bore faint traces of painted doves and vines, their eyes wide and innocent. Feels wrong to ignore it, Clara said, smoothing the sheet, like pretending the silence didn't have weight. Annie nodded. Maybe we don't have to use the room, she said, but we can stop pretending it was never part of the house. They left the window open that afternoon, and the breeze carried in the scent of hyacinth. In the music room, the cracked mirror remained. Mr. Redgrave had offered to replace it. Lord Halcombe had said no. Let it remain, he told the household. We should not erase what cracked. And so the mirror stayed, its fracture no longer a threat, but a memory, etched in silver. That evening, as Annie dusted the frames in the south corridor, she passed the portrait of the family again, the one that hung just beyond the parlor, painted when Lydia was small. Lady Marianne stood tall in her green satin gown. Lord Halcombe sat beside her, one hand resting on Lydia's shoulder. Their expressions were composed, unreadable. But this time, as Annie passed, she noticed something, a shadow. Not in the painting, but behind it, along the edge of the frame. She paused, candle held steady, and reached out. The frame gave slightly beneath her fingers. She pulled. A soft click, like breath in a throat. The painting swung forward on a hidden hinge, revealing a narrow alcove behind it. Inside, wrapped in linen, lay another bundle, smaller than the journal, heavier. Annie unwrapped it on the windowsill, hands trembling slightly. A second locket, this one intact. She opened it carefully. Inside, two miniatures. One was Elspeth, younger than she had appeared in sketches, cheeks rounder, eyes brighter. The other, an infant, hair dark, eyes bright. Lips pursed in an uncertain smile. A name was engraved behind the faceplate. Thomas Caraway Halcombe. Born July 19, 1901. died October 23rd, 1901. Annie stared. She had always known the Halcombs had lost a child. It was whispered often among the servants, how the boy had taken ill, how no one ever spoke of him afterward. But no one had mentioned a middle name. No one had dared. Caraway, Elspeth's name. She felt the breath leave her chest in a slow, careful rush. He had not only loved her, he had fathered her child. Clara found her moments later, standing still in the sun-drenched corridor, the locket open in her palm. "Oh," Clara whispered when she saw. Annie handed it to her wordlessly. The pieces were settling into place, not with drama or thunder, but with inevitability, as though the truth had always waited patiently to be gathered. That night, Annie returned to the east garden. The ivy had curled around the angel again, but did not cover her. The stone gleamed softly in the moonlight. At the base, the wreath of violets had withered, petals crumbling like secrets finally spent. She knelt and placed the locket at the foot of the statue. Not buried, not hidden, placed, offered. "I know now," she said quietly. She did not expect an answer, but above her the wind stirred gently in the hedgerow, and somewhere deep within the house, one of the bells rang once, soft and low, a child's bell, the nursery. But no one ran, no one panicked. It was not fear anymore, it was acknowledgement, recognition. Annie stood, brushed the dirt from her hands and turned toward the house. Its windows glowed with warm light, its doors stood open. The weeks passed and Graymore House began to breathe with something new. It was not joy exactly, joy is too light a word, but a kind of quiet restoration. The kind that comes after winter when frost no longer bites and the ground, though scarred, begins to soften. The corridors no longer groaned with secrets. The bells still rang, but at the right times. The mirror remained cracked, but its reflection was honest. The house had not healed completely, but it had opened its eyes. In the servants' wing, the routine of life returned, albeit altered. The silence was no longer weighted. It hummed instead with memory. Annie scrubbed floors, boiled water, and sorted linens, just as she always had. But there was something in her movements now, something rooted and sure, as though she belonged not only to her duties, but to the story of the house itself. One morning, as she polished the banister near the front stairs, Lydia Halcombe descended with a notebook in hand. She paused beside Annie, something tentative in her gaze. "I've started drawing again," she said softly without prompting. Annie looked up. Lydia's voice had always been quiet, her presence like a footnote in the household. She was not as cold as her mother, nor as brooding as her father, but she had always remained apart, floating through the house like a figure in the wallpaper. "What are you drawing?" Annie asked. "The gardens," Lydia said, "and the angel." Annie smiled. "It's a good place to start." Lydia hesitated, then added, "My father told me about Elspeth." A pause. "And about the boy." Annie set down her cloth. "I'm glad he did." Lydia met her eyes. "She wasn't just a mistake, was she?" "No," Annie said. "She was never a mistake." Lydia nodded, the corners of her mouth turning up slightly, not a smile, but something close. Then she continued down the stairs, her notebook clutched to her chest. Later that week, the old carriage house was opened for the first time in nearly a decade. The air inside was thick with dust and oil, but within it stood an untouched pianola, Elspeth's pianola, brought to the house in 1900. Lord Halcombe had it moved to the music room. He did not ask the staff. He moved it himself. John and Mr. Redgrave helped, neither speaking. They took their time, ensuring every leg was supported, every hinge unbent. When it was in place, just beside the cracked mirror, Lord Halcombe stepped back and bowed his head. "I had it silenced," he said quietly, "the week she left." Mrs. Potter, standing in the doorway, folded her arms across her apron. Then let it be heard again. And it was. That evening at supper, the soft sound of the pianola drifted down the corridors. It played slowly, almost hesitantly at first, as though the machine itself had forgotten how to breathe. Then came the tune, Elspeth's tune, the one that had haunted the mirror, the one that Annie had heard in dreams and silence and memory. Low, low, higher, and then the fourth note, resolved. Annie listened from the servants' hall, a bowl of broth cradled in her hands. The others paused in their eating. No one spoke. Even Mr. Redgrave stopped mid-sip, his expression unreadable. For a moment, every breath in the room aligned. Then Mrs. Potter raised her spoon again. "Music's a good way to start mending," she said, and supper continued. In early May, a new brass plaque was fixed beside the drawing room door, in memory of Elspeth Carroway, resident of this house, beloved, lost, known. Lady Marianne passed it one afternoon and paused, her gloved hand hovering just above the words. Annie saw her from the staircase, standing still, framed by the archway. She did not cry, she did not speak, but when she moved again, her step was slower, and in the weeks that followed, her morning walks grew longer. Sometimes she paused in the east garden, standing beneath the angel. Once, Annie saw her kneel there, placing a small bouquet of violets at the pedestal's base. Not elaborate, not theatrical, just enough. Clara asked Annie one morning if she still saw Elspeth in mirrors. No, Annie said, not like before. Not at all. Annie tilted her head. I see her in other things now. Like what? The blue drapes, she said, the old gloves in the laundry cupboard, the dust that settles just so on the pianola, the music, sometimes even in Lydia's sketches, little things. Clara smiled, nodding. She's still here, isn't she? Annie didn't answer right away. Then she said, she's not trapped anymore. Just remembered? Exactly. That night, as Annie made her way up the back stairwell with a tray of folded napkins, she passed the cracked mirror once again. It no longer shimmered, but in the fractured reflection she caught a glimpse of herself, steady, older, changed, and beside her just for a second, a flicker of blue silk, not standing, not speaking, just passing by. No sadness, no weight, just presence. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She carried on, her steps even and light. The air in Graymore carried the scent of lilac and damp stone. Spring had ripened into early summer, and the hedgerows hummed with life. In the east garden, bees moved lazily among the ivy blossoms, and the angel's wings, scrubbed clean now, caught the light in a way that made her seem watchful, almost gentle. Within the house, change was less obvious, but no less real. It showed in the way doors were left ajar instead of closed, in the way the servants no longer lowered their voices when passing certain rooms, in the way Lydia left her sketchbook on the drawing room windowsill without fear it would be taken or ridiculed. Elspeth was no longer a secret, and Graymore had become something new in the telling. One bright morning in June, a stranger arrived. Not an inspector, not a nobleman or solicitor. A woman, plain dressed, carrying a parcel and a paper satchel. Her boots were caked in country dust, and her hair was pulled back in a severe plait, streaked with early gray. She stood on the stone step with an expression both nervous and resolved. John, surprised, admitted her through the side entrance. The woman handed him a sealed envelope. For Miss Annie Fletcher, she said, voice soft and northern. She'll understand. John, unsure, brought it directly to the scullery, where Annie was peeling carrots beside Clara and Mrs. Potter. He held out the envelope. Annie took it, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened it. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper, folded once. You don't know me, but I knew her. She wrote to me once, in 1899, said she'd found work at Graymore and that she was well, said she'd met someone who made the days brighter. She was my sister. I've been searching ever since. Annie stared at the words. The room went still. Who is it? Clara asked. Annie stood heart drumming. She's here, she whispered. Elspeth's sister. They met in the drawing room. The woman's name was Margaret Carroway. She was older than Elspeth had been. Stooped slightly, her voice clipped with years of hard living, but her eyes were the same soft blue Annie had seen in every sketch, every miniature. I was her only sibling, Margaret said, sitting stiffly on the edge of the velvet settee. We were raised in Kent. When she left for service, she promised to write. She did, Annie replied. At first. Margaret nodded, as if confirming something long suspected. I wrote back, once a month for years, never received reply. No one would tell me what had happened, no obituary, no grave, just silence. She looked around the drawing room, taking in its heavy curtains, its polished piano, the large window casting golden rectangles on the floor. She loved music, Margaret said, almost absently, used to hum while mending our father's shirts. Annie placed the locket in her palm. The locket, the one from the hidden alcove. Margaret opened it slowly, with trembling fingers. When she saw the child's face, her eyes filled with tears that did not fall. I never knew she had a son, she whispered. Annie sat beside her. We only found out recently. Everything was hidden, buried. Margaret nodded. He had her eyes. They sat in silence for some time, Two women separated by generations, bound by a grief that no longer had to hide. Finally, Margaret reached into her satchel and retrieved a letter, creased, faded, delicate. She passed it to Annie. Elspeth wrote this to me, one of the last I received. Annie unfolded the letter, hands careful. Dear Maggie, Graymore is very grand, but very strange. The house is older than anything I've known, and I sometimes feel it listens when I speak. The walls seem to shift with the seasons, and there are mirrors in every hallway, as if afraid to forget. The family is kind in their own distant way. The master, Lord Halcombe, is thoughtful, more than I expected. I don't know yet what will come of it, but something is beginning, I think, something real. I play the pianola when I can, and sometimes I write poems I'll never send. I miss home. I miss you. Tell Father I haven't burned anything in weeks, though the kettle here weighs as much as a pony. Love always, Elspeth. Annie read the letter twice, then folded it again and returned it with reverence. She's still here, she said softly. Margaret looked toward the mirror in the corner, cracked, quiet. I know. That evening, Margaret Carraway was given the room that once belonged to Elspeth, not the attic, not the east wing, the room with the velvet walls now washed and aired and filled with soft light. A small vase of violets sat on the sill. Margaret sat there for hours, the door open, the windows wide. She spoke to no one, but when Annie passed, she heard her humming, low, familiar, Elspeth's tune, the same 4 notes, played not with fear but with memory. The air in Graymore carried the scent of lilac and damp stone. Spring had ripened into early summer, and the hedgerows hummed with life. In the east garden, bees moved lazily among the ivy blossoms, and the angel's wings, scrubbed clean now, caught the light in a way that made her seem watchful, almost gentle. Within the house, change was less obvious, but no less real. It showed in the way doors were left ajar instead of closed, in the way the servants no longer lowered their voices when passing certain rooms, in the way Lydia left her sketchbook on the drawing room windowsill without fear it would be taken or ridiculed. Elspeth was no longer a secret, and Graymore had become something new in the telling. One bright morning in June, a stranger arrived. Not an inspector, not a nobleman or solicitor, a woman, plain dressed, carrying a parcel and a paper satchel. Her boots were caked in country dust, and her hair was pulled back in a severe plait, streaked with early gray. She stood on the stone step with an expression both nervous and resolved. John, surprised, admitted her through the side entrance. The woman handed him a sealed envelope. For Miss Annie Fletcher, she said, voice soft and northern. She'll understand. John, unsure, brought it directly to the scullery, where Annie was peeling carrots beside Clara and Mrs. Potter. He held out the envelope. Annie took it, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened it. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper folded once. You don't know me, but I knew her. She wrote to me once in 1899, said she'd found work at Graymore and that she was well, said she'd met someone who made the days brighter. She was my sister. I've been searching ever since. Annie stared at the words. The room went still. Who is it? Clara asked. Annie stood, heart drumming. She's here, she whispered. Elspeth's sister. They met in the drawing room. The woman's name was Margaret Carraway. She was older than Elspeth had been, stooped slightly, her voice clipped with years of hard living. But her eyes were the same soft blue Annie had seen in every sketch, every miniature. I was her only sibling, Margaret said, sitting stiffly on the edge of the velvet settee. We were raised in Kent. When she left for service, she promised to write. She did, Annie replied. At first. Margaret nodded, as if confirming something long suspected. I wrote back, once a month, for years, never received reply. No one would tell me what had happened. No obituary, no grave, just silence. She looked around the drawing room, taking in its heavy curtains, its polished piano, the large window casting golden rectangles on the floor. She loved music, Margaret said, almost absently. Used to hum while mending our father's shirts. Annie placed the locket in her palm. The locket, the one from the hidden alcove. Margaret opened it slowly, with trembling fingers. When she saw the child's face, her eyes filled with tears that did not fall. I never knew she had a son, she whispered. Annie sat beside her. We only found out recently. Everything was hidden, buried. Margaret nodded. He had her eyes. They sat in silence for some time, two women separated by generations, bound by a grief that no longer had to hide. Finally, Margaret reached into her satchel and retrieved a letter, creased, faded, delicate. She passed it to Annie. Elspeth wrote this to me, one of the last I received. Annie unfolded the letter, hands careful. Dear Maggie, Graymore is very grand, but very strange. The house is older than anything I've known, and I sometimes feel it listens when I speak. The walls seem to shift with the seasons, and there are mirrors in every hallway as if afraid to forget. The family is kind in their own distant way. The master, Lord Halcombe, is thoughtful. More than I expected. I don't know yet what will come of it, but something is beginning, I think. Something real. I play the pianola when I can, and sometimes I write poems I'll never send. I miss home. I miss you. Tell father I haven't burned anything in weeks, though the kettle here weighs as much as a pony. Love always. Annie read the letter twice, then folded it again and returned it with reverence. She's still here, she said softly. Margaret looked toward the mirror in the corner. Cracked, quiet. I know. That evening, Margaret Carroway was given the room that once belonged to Elspeth. Not the attic, not the east wing. The room with the velvet walls, now washed and aired and filled with soft light. A small vase of violets sat on the sill. Margaret sat there for hours, the door open, the windows wide. She spoke to no one, but when Annie passed, she heard her humming, low, familiar, Elspeth's tune, the same 4 notes, played not with fear but with memory. Morning came gently to Graymore House. The first light slipped through the garden ivy, threading golden stripes across the walls of the eastern corridor. In the kitchen, the hearth crackled with a lazy fire. The smell of bread, yeasty and warm, floated through the rooms like a lullaby. And in the chamber once hidden, now opened and reclaimed, Margaret Carroway stood by the tall window, her hands folded neatly, her gaze lingering on the garden where the angel stood. She wore her sister's gloves. They were old, a little thin at the fingertips, the lace yellowed, but she wore them anyway, as though they gave her shape. As though in wearing them, she could walk in Elspeth's place for just a little while. Annie found her there, just past 7. She paused in the doorway, unsure whether to enter. Margaret turned, smiling faintly. I couldn't sleep. The house is quieter now, Annie said, stepping inside, but it still stirs in the early hours. Margaret nodded. I can feel her here, she murmured. Not haunting, just hovering, like a song half finished. Annie stood beside her. She left her mark. We all carry it now. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the morning unfold. Below in the garden, Lydia Halcombe appeared, sketchbook in hand. She made her way to the angel, crouched by the pedestal, and began to draw. She looks like Elspeth, Margaret said softly. Yes, that same quiet sadness, but something else, too. Hope, Annie said. I think she's trying to understand. Margaret looked down at her gloved hands. She deserves to. Later that day, a small ceremony was held. Not formal, not grand, just a gathering in the East Garden. At Lord Halcombe's quiet request, a new stone had been placed beside the angel's pedestal, smooth gray granite carved with care. Elspeth Carroway, beloved daughter, sister, mother, 1890-1901. The date was not exact, but no one questioned it. The staff came first, lining the edge of the path in clean aprons and polished boots. Mr. Redgrave stood near the hedge, his hat in his hands. Mrs. Potter wiped her eyes once, briskly, then folded her arms with a kind of fierce satisfaction. Clara held a single violet. Then the family arrived. Lord Halcombe walked slowly, his cane tapping against the stone. Lady Marianne followed, her face calm, her expression unreadable, though her eyes lingered on the stone longer than anyone else's. Lydia wore pale blue. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, and no one spoke for a long time. The breeze moved through the ivy. A bee hummed lazily past. Then Margaret stepped forward. She carried Elspeth's journal in her hands. I've no speech, she said, voice low but steady, only memory. She opened the book to the first page and placed it on the pedestal, beneath the angel's outstretched hand. She wasn't just my sister, Margaret continued. She was light and music and laughter in a room that didn't deserve her. And for a long time I didn't know where she'd gone. Now I do. She stepped back, and the silence that followed felt sacred. Annie stepped forward next. She held the locket, the same locket once hidden in a hollow behind the portrait, now polished and whole again. She laid it gently atop the journal. She loved, Annie said simply, and then she stepped aside. Others followed, a ribbon, a sketch, a pressed flower, each offering small, each offering real. No priest came, no scripture was read. But in that garden, with the sun high and the breeze steady, the truth was spoken in silence. Elspeth Carraway had lived, and now she had been named. That evening, the house was more still than it had ever been. No bells rang, no doors creaked. Even the cracked mirror held its breath. In her room, Annie sat by the window, a cup of warm milk in her hands. The moon rose slowly above the trees, casting long shadows across the terrace. She watched the wind bend the ivy and thought of Elspeth, not as she had first appeared, distant and ghostly, but as she had come to be known. A sister, a mother, a woman. Margaret would leave in the morning, return to Kent, to a life she had long paused but never abandoned. But her presence had done what no ritual could. She had closed the circle. Annie sipped her milk, then reached beneath her pillow and drew out a final letter, one Elspeth had written in the margins of her journal, never meant to be seen. It read, "If ever someone remembers me, not as a shadow, not as a whisper, but as someone real, then I will know I was not lost, only waiting." Annie folded the page, pressed it to her chest, and smiled. Summer settled softly over Graymore. The sun hung longer in the sky each evening, casting gold across the floorboards and turning the glass of the old windows into shimmering panels of light. Flowers bloomed wild along the garden paths. Violets, foxglove, roses that had crept from their beds and tangled freely around the wrought iron railings. Inside, the house had grown quieter in a way that felt whole, not hollow. A stillness that was not burdened, but balanced. It had taken weeks, perhaps months, but the weight had shifted. What once had haunted now hovered like memory. The past was no longer a secret. It was a companion, walking silently through the rooms, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and the sound of a remembered song. Annie rose each morning with ease now. The fear that had once curled in the back of her throat, the tension that stiffened her spine as she passed certain mirrors or stairwells, it had faded. In its place was purpose, something firm. She still scrubbed the floors, still carried coal and polished banisters, but with every motion came a quiet understanding that she was more than the work. She was part of the story now, woven into the fabric of Graymore as tightly as the velvet along the drawing room walls. One afternoon, as she arranged fresh linens in the guest rooms, she heard footsteps behind her. Light, hesitant. It was Lydia. "I was wondering," Lydia began, her hands folded tightly, "if I might show you something." Annie nodded. "Of course." They walked together down the long hallway and into the library. The large table near the window had been cleared of books. In their place lay sketches, pages upon pages, spread like petals across the surface. Some were clean and formal, others smudged and half-finished. Annie leaned closer. There were drawings of the angel, of the cracked mirror, of the pianola, of Elspeth's gloves resting on a windowsill, of the bells in all their strange and humming presence. And at the center of it all, a sketch of the East Garden at dusk, two figures standing in silence, one in an apron, one in gloves. "I thought," Lydia said softly, "if no one ever paints her, really paints her, then she might disappear again." Annie blinked back a sudden wave of warmth. "You've captured her." "I hope so," Lydia said. "It's hard to draw someone you've never seen." Annie looked again. "But you've seen her," she said, "even if only in what she left behind." They sat together for a while, sorting the sketches, trimming edges, arranging them in a small folio. Lydia wrote a name on the inside cover, E. Carraway, Study of Presence. "I want to show it in the autumn," she said, "in the village, just for a weekend. I think the people there deserve to see her too." Annie nodded. "So do the people who forgot her." That evening, as the sun began to set, the entire household gathered in the south lawn for a quiet supper. Long tables had been brought out. Nothing formal, just warm bread, lentil soup, fruit preserves, and cool elderflower cordial. John played a small concertina in the shade, and even Mr. Redgrave allowed himself a single glass of wine. Annie sat beside Clara, their shoulders touching, watching fireflies begin to blink in the tall grass. Lord Halcombe raised a glass at one point, cleared his throat, and said nothing. He simply lifted it higher. No toast, no speech, just a gesture. And somehow it was enough. Later, when the dishes had been cleared and the lanterns lit along the edge of the terrace, Annie wandered back toward the East Garden. She passed the angel, its features soft in the candle glow. The stone was warm from the day's sun, and just beyond it she saw Margaret's parting gift. A small wooden bench, plain but carefully carved, now set beneath the ivy-covered archway. A brass plaque on its back read, "For those who remember, MC." Annie sat down. The garden hummed with crickets and breeze. The bells were quiet. The mirror was quiet. But Annie could still feel her. Elspeth, not standing, not watching, just present, in the folds of the ivy, in the memory of music, in the pulse of a house that no longer hid what it once feared. She folded her hands in her lap, closed her eyes, and listened. And from somewhere deep inside the walls, she imagined the faintest echo of a lullaby. 4 notes, played only once. Then silence. But not the kind that forgets. The next morning arrived with the hush of a house exhaling. Sunlight poured across the flagstones in thick beams, warming the kitchen tiles and catching the copper pots along the wall. Mrs. Potter hummed softly over her bread dough, sleeves rolled, her eyes softer than usual. The scullery gleamed. The scent of lemons and flour hung in the air like a memory of summer holidays long past. Annie moved with familiar rhythm. Water in the basin, folded towels, the fire in the library lit before breakfast. She polished the brass handles of the study doors, her reflection staring calmly back at her from the curved surfaces. There were no footsteps behind her, no sounds in the mirror, and yet the house felt full, not crowded, but accompanied. She found Clara in the hallway outside the drawing room, fussing with a new potted plant on the windowsill. "Miss Lydia brought it down from the nursery," Clara said, patting the soil with a folded scrap of muslin. "She said the light's better here now." Annie smiled. The pot held a cluster of violets. "They've taken root quickly," she said. "Things do when they're meant to," Clara replied. A silence settled between them. Comfortable, familiar. Annie looked toward the drawing room. The blue velvet curtains were drawn open now always. The pianola stood beside the cracked mirror like an old storyteller, silent but ready, waiting for its song. "She hasn't appeared again, has she?" Clara asked almost shyly. Annie shook her head. "Not in the way she used to." "You miss her?" "Yes," Annie said simply. Clara touched her shoulder. "So do I." They lingered a little longer, watching the light climb the wall and then parted ways, Clara to the upper floors, Annie to the east wing, where the ivy had begun to bloom with tiny white buds. She passed the angel, the new bench, the plaque, and she kept walking. The far edge of the east garden held a gate. It had once led to a narrow orchard long since overgrown. No one went there anymore, not because of fear, but because time had made the path disappear. But now the weeds had been trimmed, the stones swept, a new archway had been cleared of moss. Beyond it, the orchard opened in rows of knotted trees, gnarled, silver-barked, yet still bearing fruit. Apples hung low, soft green and pale red, touched by the sun. Annie stepped into the shade beneath them and breathed in deeply. The air here was cooler, fresher, untouched by sorrow. It felt like a threshold, a place for beginnings. At the base of one of the oldest trees stood another small stone, unmarked, plain, a child's stone, set with care, an offering. She knelt before it and placed her palm flat upon it, not to pray, not to summon, but to promise. The boy unnamed for so long was no longer lost. He had a place now, a name, a mother remembered. And with that knowing came something deeper, something Annie hadn't felt since her first night in the house. Peace. When she rose again, the sun had moved, dappling the ground in light and shadow. The trees rustled overhead, branches swaying gently. She made her way back toward the house, past the angel, past the bench, past the windows where curtains no longer stayed drawn. In the servants' corridor, Susan had returned, quietly, without ceremony. Her hair had grown longer, and her eyes were different now, sharper. She didn't ask what had happened. She only hugged Annie without words and stepped back into her duties as though no time had passed at all. Graymore had accepted her back, just as it had accepted its own story. Later that afternoon, Annie found Lydia sitting on the stone steps outside the west wing, sketching in charcoal. A new scene. The orchard. "I didn't know we had one," Lydia said, her pencil moving slowly. "It feels forgotten." "Not anymore." Lydia paused and looked up. "Did she go?" Annie sat beside her. "Not gone," she said softly. "Just at rest." Lydia nodded. They sat there until the sun dipped below the hedgerows, the world around them turning slowly to gold and blue. From somewhere within the house, the pianola began to play. It wasn't Elspeth's song this time. It was something new. tentative, sweet, like the house learning to sing again in its own voice. The season turned again. Summer, once warm and drowsy, began to exhale its final breath. The wind shifted ever so slightly, curling cooler beneath the eaves of Graymore House. The shadows grew longer in the afternoons, and the leaves at the edge of the orchard caught the faintest blush of gold. Inside, the house wore its quiet differently now. It no longer cloaked itself in secrecy. Its stillness wasn't silence anymore. It was steadiness. A hush not of what was buried, but of what had finally been spoken. Annie felt it with every step she took. In the morning when she lit the fires in the parlor, the creak of the grate sounded softer. The bell in the study hadn't rung out of turn in weeks. The mirror in the music room remained cracked, but the fracture hadn't deepened. No strange shadows moved behind it. No shimmer. Just the reflection of what was truly there. Real things, lived things, remembered things. One morning, Annie made her way to the orchard again. She carried a small basket of clean linens under one arm, some to hang in the garden to dry, others to leave folded on the bench beside the angel, as she often did now. It had become her quiet ritual. When she reached the child's stone beneath the apple tree, she paused. The ground was dry. The grass had grown up slightly around the base, but the stone itself remained visible. Someone had placed a small wooden toy there, a carved horse, rough but lovingly made. It hadn't been there yesterday. Annie bent down, brushed her fingers over it, and smiled. She didn't need to ask who had brought it. The house had many caretakers now. Back at the bench, she sat for a moment in the low sun, letting the breeze press gently through the folds of her apron. A few sparrows fluttered in the hedge nearby. From the upper windows, she could hear the faint sound of a window being opened. Lydia, most likely, letting in the morning air. And then, for the first time in many weeks, Annie reached into her pocket and pulled out the final page from Elspeth's journal. It had been folded, tucked into a cloth envelope, kept close to her heart. She opened it carefully. The handwriting had grown looser, as though written in candlelight, in a moment of hurried thought. If one day someone walks these halls without fear, without looking over their shoulder, if they light a fire and know the warmth will last, if they carry my name without shame or whisper, then that will be enough. I don't need a monument, only to be made part of the story again. Annie read the words slowly. Then she stood, walked to the edge of the garden, and pinned the page gently beneath a stone on the sundial. The wind stirred it briefly before it settled. That night, supper was held in the dining hall, not the servants' dining room, but the main one, where portraits of Halcombe ancestors watched with oil-painted eyes from every wall. But tonight, there were no formal place cards. The staff and the family sat together, a single long table, simple and white linened, candles flickering in mismatched holders. The air was filled with the scent of roasted parsnips and herbed broth, fresh apple tart and lemon balm tea. The pianola played softly in the drawing room beyond, the notes drifting in like an old friend. Mr. Redgrave poured wine with the steadiness of habit. Mrs. Potter carved the roast herself, apron over a black dress she wore once a year. Clara laughed at something John said, wiping her hand on her napkin and shaking her head in mock disdain. Annie sat beside Lydia, who brought out her folio again, now filled not only with sketches of Elspeth, but of the people who lived within the house now. The cook's hands, the parlor maid's broom, a child's stone in the orchard. They were not only drawings, they were records. Lydia passed the book to Annie without a word. Annie flipped to the final page. There, beneath a tree, a woman sat with her back to the viewer, the hem of her gown brushing the grass. In front of her, a child's toy rested on a stone. Above them, the house rose in the distance, not looming, not grand, but steady, familiar, loved. And in the corner, delicately written, "For those who came before, for those who remain." Annie closed the book and set it gently between them. And in that moment, with laughter humming around her, with candlelight warming the walls, with a story told and retold in every corner of Graymore, she knew it was almost time, not for an ending, but for a door to close, softly, and another to open. The final days of summer slipped quietly into autumn. It happened slowly, first in the morning light, which took on a crisper edge, then in the scent of the earth, heavier and sweeter like ripened fruit left too long on the vine. The ivy on the stone walls of Graymore House deepened to a dark, brambled green. The apples in the orchard hung low and golden, ready to fall. And still the house stood steady. No bells rang out of place. No mirrors shimmered. The music from the pianola played only when asked, its notes mellow and full. Elspeth's presence no longer stirred the air in sudden gusts or whispered down corridors in dreams. She had become part of the foundation, not a ghost, a memory, a name spoken aloud, a truth made visible. Annie rose earlier than usual on the first true morning of autumn. The sky was a pale sweep of gray-blue, and the ground outside her window sparkled faintly with dew. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and moved through the servants' corridor, not to the scullery or the laundry, but to the library. The room was empty at this hour. Soft light filtered through the high windows, touching the edge of the carpet and catching the gold leaf of the spines that lined the walls. In the corner, beside the writing desk, the folio of Lydia's drawings sat neatly stacked, tied with a ribbon of navy silk. Annie approached the side table beneath the stained glass window. Elspeth's journal still rested there, untouched now for weeks. She opened it one final time, her fingers tracing the cover as she turned to the middle, the page with the rough sketch of the nursery door, the one with the claw marks no one could explain. The marks were real. They had happened, but their purpose had changed. They were not scratches of rage. They were not haunting. They were what remained when someone tried desperately to be remembered. Annie touched the edge of the drawing, and then, carefully, reverently, she closed the book. She placed it into a wooden case beside the folio, bound in linen, and added a note in her own hand, belonging to the history of Graymore House, not to be hidden. Later that morning, a small parcel arrived from Kent. Inside was a letter, handwritten in steady, firm strokes. Dear Miss Fletcher, I've made arrangements with a small archive in the village. They've agreed to preserve Elspeth's journal, along with Lydia's sketches and the documents you and your friends uncovered. The librarian asked what name the collection should carry. I told her simply, the Caraway Papers. Thank you for giving me my sister again, for letting me stand where she stood. With all my heart, Margaret. Annie folded the letter and pressed it flat. She read it again before placing it in the same wooden case. That evening, as the sun dipped low beyond the hills, the household gathered once more, not for ceremony, not for remembrance, but for supper beneath the trees. The table was smaller this time, familiar. The orchard leaves had begun to fall in lazy spirals, and the apples overhead creaked gently on their branches. Mrs. Potter served apple tart. Mr. Redgrave offered a single toast. Lydia shared a new sketch, a page of the house drawn from the perspective of the eastern garden bench, with the angel at its center. There was laughter. There was stillness. And there was something else too. Closure. When the lanterns were lit and the dishes cleared, Annie walked alone to the orchard. She stopped before the child's stone and knelt beside it. A handful of fresh wildflowers had been tucked into the grass, their stems tied with blue ribbon. She didn't know who had left them. Perhaps no one did. But the gesture spoke clearly. We see you. We remember. You belong. Back inside, Annie passed the cracked mirror in the music room. She paused as she always did, but this time, the reflection held only herself. Whole. Unshadowed. Calm. The mirror no longer shimmered. It had nothing more to show. As she climbed the servants' stairs for the last time that night, the air felt soft and light. A faint breeze passed through the upper window, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and windfall apples. She stepped into her room, undressed, and lay beneath the quilt with the window open wide beside her. No voice came, no song. Just the slow, steady breath of a house at peace. And as her eyes drifted closed, she thought not of endings, but of beginnings. Of Elspeth, of the boy, of the woman who returned, of the girl who stayed, of what it means to be remembered. And how, in the end, it was never about ghosts, it was always about grace.